I bet I did it. And now we're on. I can turn on a button. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to another installment of Crossroads of Ideas. I'm Laura Heisler. I'm Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Director of Outreach for the Mortgage Institute for Research, and a partner with the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And these are the three organizations that collaborate each month during the academic year to bring you this series, which takes a look at issues that matter to all of us and that happen to be the subject of research here at UW-Madison. This year, if you've been coming to some of our sessions, you know that we're doing a special mini-series tackling, quote unquote, the big questions. We begin with what is life, we cruise through what is consciousness, what is happiness. Today, we address what is free will. And before I tell you a little bit more about this evening's event and the final installment in this mini-series, I do want to take a moment and ask you to join me in acknowledging the land that we are on here at UW-Madison, and for many of you where you are over Zoom. UW-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully fought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. We're going to be concluding our Big Questions mini-series next month on April 5th, looking at what is morality at the same time, 7 p.m., same place, here as well as over Zoom. For this evening, in just a moment, I'll introduce the curator of this series. I do want to mention a little bit about how the session will go. You'll hear a little bit about the series, and then our moderator, Adam Nelson, will say a little bit about this evening's subject. Then we'll have two sequential talks, about 20-25 minutes each. After that, Adam will join the two speakers, and they'll have a bit of a facilitated discussion. And then with the last 15 minutes or so, beginning at about 8:15, we'll open it up to audience questions. We will end promptly at 8:30. If you're here in the room and you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please line up by this microphone here in the middle of the room. If you're online and you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A rather than the chat, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. I will read your questions to the panelists if you're asking a question over Zoom. And again, we'll get to as many as we can, so we look forward to that part of the evening. And with that, I would like to introduce Larry Shapiro, the Barrett Ench Professor of Philosophy here at UW-Madison, to say a little bit more about what inspired the Big Questions mini-series and what you can expect in terms of an intellectual discussion. So Larry, please come on up and say a little bit about the series.
Thank you, Laura. Laura is very instrumental in putting this series together with me. The idea for this series came about because across my computer screen every morning, I'd find articles like "Scientists prove there is no free will," "Scientists prove there is no right or wrong," "Scientists prove that there's no meaning in life." And I thought, wow, how do they do that? And I started reading about scientific papers that treat an issue that has tended to fall within the realm of philosophy. So now there are a lot of scientists looking at philosophical questions, sort of restarting to look at philosophical questions. And I thought it'd be fun to bring together a philosopher and a scientist to talk about the big questions, these sorts of questions that any intellectually curious human being will reflect upon at some point in their life. And so we have here the fourth of the big questions that out of the five that we'll be talking about. So the topic of free will is, of course, of perennial philosophical interest. The philosopher wants to know how it's possible, if it's possible, to be free in a world that is, we have every reason to believe, deterministic. So if everything that's happening in the world right now was caused and necessitated to happen by preceding events, then had your great-great-great-grandparents known the laws of physics, they'd be able to predict that you'd be here listening to a talk on free will this evening. And that seems to suggest that we don't have free will, and philosophers want to figure out whether and how we do. Psychologists, on the other hand, as we'll learn, are interested in questions like that, but also questions about when we develop this idea that we have free will, when does a child learn to distinguish between what they can't do freely, like play with matches because they're told not to, versus fly around the room because it's impossible to do that? So one question a psychologist might ask is, at what stage does a child develop this idea of being unable or able to do something? And we could also ask, well, are there cultures in which freedom of will is more or less emphasized? So I won't go on because we have others who will do that for me. But I'd now like to introduce Adam Nelson, who is the Senior Associate Dean of the School of Education here at UW and a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Educational Policy Studies and History. Dr. Nelson received his PhD in history from Brown University, and among his many publications is the book Education and Democracy, The Meaning of Alexander Michael-John, 1872 to 1964. And Dr. Nelson's currently finishing 2 new books. One, A Marketplace of Ideas, The Economy of Higher Education in Early America. And secondly, Capital of Mind, The Idea of a Modern American University. And both of these are forthcoming with University of Chicago Press. So I leave it to Adam.
You stuck that too?
Okay, I just push the button.
Just the back, the backspace.
Okay. Thanks, Larry, and welcome everyone. Thanks for attending tonight's next Crossroads event on the topic of free will. As Larry mentioned, I'm an historian, and one question historians love to ask is whether people shape history or whether history shapes people. That is, whether individuals have the freedom or the agency to affect the course or direction of their lives, or whether larger cultural, political, social, even geopolitical forces actually determine whether any one individual can or cannot do or accomplish what they might otherwise will. So for my students, this question, whether people shape history or history shapes people, is what makes historical study either fascinating as they see how people as individuals or in groups can make a difference for themselves and others. Or for others, it makes the study of history frustrating as they see how systems and structures of society present us as historical beings with more limited sets of opportunities or choices than we might otherwise be able to imagine, or perhaps more limited sets of opportunities and choices than other people might have, even in our own time. So in a way, the question is whether we should think of the glass of free will as half full or half empty. Well, our speakers tonight, I think, will shed some light on the question of free will, not from the perspective of history, but from the perspectives of philosophy and psychology. And then after we hear from them, we'll have a chance for discussion. Our first speaker will be Martha Gibson. Professor Gibson received her PhD in philosophy here at the University of Wisconsin and has been on the faculty since 1992. She specializes in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. Her book, From Naming to Saying, The Unity of the Proposition, was published in 2003, and she's published articles on the philosophy of Kant, theories of meaning, and tonight's subject, free will. Our second speaker will be Tamar Kushnir. Professor Kushnir teaches in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke and is the director of the Early Childhood Cognition Laboratory at Duke. She received her MA in statistics and her PhD in cognitive psychology from UC Berkeley and was a postdoc fellow at Michigan. She was previously on the faculty of the Department of Human Development at Cornell, and her research on social learning and social cognition in young children is motivated by a long-standing curiosity about the developing mind, and in particular, how children learn about themselves and others from actively exploring the world around them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Martha Gibson up to the podium.
No, it's not. What's that? It's not advancing. There, no. Okay, thanks. Sorry. Okay. Well, first I want to say thank you to the audience for coming, and thank you to those in the Wisconsin Institute of Discovery who have put all this work together to make this event happen, and welcome. So the topic tonight is free will, and I'll try to get right to the topic and talk first about what the will is and what freedom of the will might be. So I'm going to start with John Locke's definition of the will. This is from his essay concerning the human understanding, 1690. And he says, this, at least I think evident, that we find in ourselves a power to begin, to continue, or end several actions of our minds and motions of our bodies, barely by a thought or preference of the mind ordering, or as it were, commanding the doing or not doing of the action. So by commanding my fingers to wiggle, I can wiggle them. By commanding them to continue to wiggle them, I can, and by commanding to stop them, I can. The wiggling of my fingers is in the control of my will. By contrast, by commanding my teeth to wiggle, I can't move my teeth. I can't wiggle my teeth. So wiggling my teeth is not in the command of the will. Now, Locke thought that our concepts of freedom and of necessity had to do with the extent of the power of the will. And so people are more or less free depending on the extent to which the will can move the body and mind to action. He gives examples where we're necessitated, where we're unfree. That is where motions of our body or in our body are unfree. The blood circulating, we can't stop the blood circulating through the circulatory system by commanding it to stop. That movement in our body is necessary. We're necessitated in respect to that. Another example he gives is convulsive motions of the legs that make the person, as it were, dance. Ordering the convulsive motions to stop doesn't work. They're not in our control. We're necessitated with regard to such motions. Locke thought this extended not just to motions of the body, but to acts of mind as well. So he says, a man on the rack is not at liberty to lay by the idea of pain and divert himself with other contemplations. So the point is, while some things in our mind we can control, we may be able to tell ourselves to pay attention, or to quit daydreaming, or to quit festering about something we're thinking about. But if you're on the rack, he says, he thinks that you're necessitated to think of pain. Even if you were to try to stop thinking of pain, you would be unable to do that. So Locke and Hobbes before him understood freedom as coming in degrees. We're more or less free depending upon how many of our choices we can act on. So the prisoner chained to the wall in the prison is less free than the prisoner who can walk around his cell. And the prisoner in the minimum security facility is more free than either of the other to prisoners. And of course, we're more free than any of the prisoners. You're free to the degree that you can act upon what you might choose. And when certain things would stop you, impediments in the case of prison, external physical impediments like bars and chains, you aren't free. And of course, this kind of idea extends beyond prisons and things like that. Obviously, someone in extreme poverty might be a lot less free than we are, because there are fewer of the things they might choose to do that they could do. There are, again, impediments to their acting upon our choices. So here's the kind of picture that emerges from the Hobbesian and Lockean conception. Our choices ideally cause our actions. When something blocks the choice causing the action, then we are not free. And the greater our capacity to do what we might choose, the freer we are. Now, notice here that whether you're free or not doesn't depend upon whether you're caused to do what you do, are determined to do what you do. Something causes the prisoner to be standing. Something causes the prisoner that gets up and walks around his cell to walk around his cell. He's still more free than the guy chained to the wall. So freedom has to do with a capacity we have, or lack, to act upon the choices that we might make. Now, this picture may be good as far as it goes. It captures cases in which we think people aren't free because there are external physical impediments like bars and chains that prevent them from doing what they choose. But the picture is inadequate because it fails to account for other cases in which we think a person may not be free. Consider an agoraphobic who day after day, week after week, year after year, sits home in her house. She's not locked in her house. There aren't homicidal maniacs outside roaming the streets, preventing her from going out. She could go out if she chose to go out. So she seems to meet this condition if she chose to. There are not external physical impediments that are going to block her acting that way. The problem seems to be that in some sense she can't choose otherwise. Think about the difference between an agoraphobic and a non-agoraphobic, both of whom stay home, choose to stay home on a particularly miserable day. It's pouring outside. Still, we think there's a difference between them because the non-agoraphobic could have chosen to go out, but in some sense, the agoraphobic couldn't choose to go out. And the same thing seems to apply to other sorts of cases like drug addicts. I mean, there seems to be a difference between the drug addict deciding to take heroin and the non-addict, say the person who's taking it for the first time, deciding to do heroin. Again, we think that the non-addict, in some sense, could have chosen otherwise, whereas the addict couldn't. And you can apply this as well to compulsives. So cases of addiction, phobia, compulsion, they suggest that to act of our own free will, we need to have not just the capacity to act otherwise if we choose, but the capacity to choose otherwise to start with. And if we investigate why we think that they can't choose otherwise, it seems like, if you take the agoraphobic, for example, she's incapable of making the decisions she ought to. Now, what do I mean that she ought to? The decisions we would make? No, I think the decisions she ought to make, given the very beliefs and desires that she has. The agoraphobic can't get herself in the state of mind. She can't seem to form the intention or decision required for her to leave the house, even in situations where it's quite important for her to do so. The addict seems always to choose the drugs. He's unable to decide not to, even though he may see his course of action as irrational. indeed as entirely destructive, given other things he desires and believes. And so from this emerges a kind of concept of what freedom of will consists in. And the claim is that phobics, addicts, compulsives, and such lack freedom, not because of external impediments, but because of internal impediments that prevent them from making the choices that they should make given their own beliefs and desires. Now, this conception of freedom of will has been worked out in contemporary philosophy in quite different ways by a bunch of different philosophers. I'll mention just a few here. I won't go through them all. But for example, Gary Watson thinks that what goes wrong with the addict is that the desires that cause her to act are not in sync with her evaluative judgments about what's good. So she may understand that this is really bad for her, that this is ruining her life, that the drugs are not inherently good for her. It's not good for her to be doing this. She values these other things, and yet the desires that cause her to act don't align with the desires that arise from her evaluative judgments. So that's his diagnosis of what goes wrong. Dennis Stamp has a different sort of view. He thinks of a free will like a free working weather vane. So the weather vane is free when it can spin around and point in any direction the wind might be blowing. It's unfree when it's stuck in a certain position and won't move with the determining powers of the wind. And by analogy, the will is free when it can swing around and point in any direction, that is, make any choice that might be rational given the agent's beliefs and desires. So the sense in which the agoraphobic couldn't choose otherwise is that were it rational for her to leave, she would stay stuck on staying in the house. She wouldn't then swing around and leave. Anyway, that gives you just a little flavor of two accounts. There are many accounts besides the ones I listed that are broadly in this vein of reason responsiveness. So we amend our earlier picture and we talk about two different, where freedom might arise, as it were, in two places in the causal chain. We start with what Locke and Hobbes talked about, whether you're free between the level of the choice and the action. And again, the greater our capacity to do what we choose, the freer we are. But now we move back on the causal chain and ask not, could we have acted otherwise, but could we have chosen otherwise? And here you get a second concept of freedom, here the freedom of the will. And the idea here is that the greater the capacity to choose whatever might be rational relative to our beliefs and desires, the freer the will. Okay, so far I've described one standard picture of what freedom of will consists in. In this last section, I want to question that picture, particularly the primacy of rationality in the account. We've looked at cases in which a person does not have free will because they can't make rational decisions. But oddly, we can look at other cases in which a person does have free will precisely because they have the capacity to make irrational decisions. And indeed, certain paradigm cases wherein people display freedom of will are cases where people act irrationally, when they ignore reasons. So while rationality can sometimes free us, as in the case of the agoraphobic or the addict, it can also bind and constrain us. And then only our being unresponsive to reasons, only our having the capacity to make irrational decisions can free us. And so I want to give you three kinds of cases to support this idea that to have freedom of will, we have to be able to make irrational decisions. Oh, I skipped a slide, sorry. Basically, let's just talk about the last bullet point. Whether someone's will is free or not again, doesn't depend on whether she's causally determined to make the choice that she does. It has to do with whether she has the capacity to make other decisions that might be rational for her to make, given her beliefs and desires. Okay, so now I'm on to the irrational. What sort of cases might support the idea, not that you need the capacity to act rationally, but you need the capacity to act irrationally? Take cases of coercion. The gunman says to me, your money or your life. And I say, no, I'm not giving you my money. Now, as long as I'm not pathologically countersuggestible, that I do the opposite of what anybody tells me to do, and I do this, as it were, I can do this. I mean, if I can do it, I don't know that I could do it. Suppose I could do it. Obviously, this is utterly irrational. I know full well that my money is not worth risking my life for. But when people refuse to give in to the person coercing them, they are acting irrationally. And yet it seems to be a display of freedom of will. Think about how coercion works. What does the coercer do? He makes it rational to do what he wants you to do. He wants you to think, I have no other choice than to do what he says. And in a person's define a coercer, they are refusing to let him, as it were, they're refusing to be bound by or constrained by the very good reasons that he gave you for doing what he wants you to do. And so in refusing to be coerced, I mean, if you can do that, you have to have the capacity to act irrationally, and yet that seems to display your freedom of will. Take another kind of case. This is actually, I think, not in the Ukraine, but an iconic photo from Tiananmen Square. Another time people stood in front of tanks. So, but let's just take the cases in Ukraine where people are standing completely unarmed in front of Russian tanks, yelling obscenities at them. Now, I mean, surely they recognize that this is not in their best interest. It's crazy to do, that they aren't advancing some cause by this. They'd be better off going and getting armed and fighting if they wanted to advance the cause, but they're just going to stand there anyway. It's quite an irrational act, but it is, if anything, is an incredible display of freedom of will. And I think will is involved there, not just freedom, but freedom of will. They make themselves stand there. They will that they stand there. The last cases are more ordinary. Right, we all know willful children, willful, but adults can be willful too. And they're going to do what they're going to do, and nothing is going to stop them, or if something's going to stop them, it's sure not going to be reasons. And again, they can be acting of their own free will. More mundane things are just the fact that, look, there's lots of times when we don't do what's most rational. We're careless, fed up, lazy, and we just don't do the things we ought to do if we were being rational. And yet it seems like the lazy, careless, fed up person, they all can be acting of their own free will. Okay, so what is the point of these examples? What do these cases show? Well, I think it shows this, that freedom of will, the possession of it in full measure, requires an ability beyond the ability to respond to reasons, to evaluate options, compare outcomes, rank preferences, produce appropriate choices, etc. we aren't just rational calculators. Freedom of will is not just a matter of our being rational calculators. We're weirder kinds of beings than that, I think. But that doesn't really reveal the underlying problem, namely that it seems impossible to characterize what single capacity could make the will free. Is there some single thing going on? And the problem seems to be that the capacities that are required are opposing capacities. So we need to be able to form decisions both in accordance with and contrary, let's say, to our weightiest desires, or far and against your desires, all things considered, or far and against what's in your self-interest, far and against what one thinks is morally required. And I could keep going in this way. And so ask yourself, well, is freedom of will some single capacity? If not, how can it require these completely opposing capacities? And so I suggest a solution to it. Start with this: we can be freed or constrained by rationality, freed or constrained by irrationality. But what is it in this we're constrained against doing, whether by rationality or irrationality? Well, simply our own will. We're constrained against doing as we will. So it's not the capacity for rational or irrational choices per se that make for freedom of the will, but rather the capacity to choose whatever one might will. And what we will sometimes happens to be the rational or irrational thing. So we're going to need those capacities. But what one wills, it doesn't necessarily reduce to what's most rational or most irrational relative to one's beliefs and desires, nor, I suggest, is it necessarily what one chooses to do. So I think the will of the human being is quite an odd thing. We can will to do almost anything. And it is in that way up to us. People have often thought that there's nothing at all that causally determines that we have the will that we do. I think that what's true instead is that anything at all might, in principle, cause us to have the will that we do. For the object of the will, it doesn't have some single source. It's not just desires or evaluative beliefs, or risky behavior, or whatever. So I think the object of the will doesn't have a single source. And in that, I think we're different from most, if not all, animals. So I'll end by saying just that I think that what I say is going to have a connection to what Tamar says, that she's going to talk about how the power of our imagination enables us to make certain choices. And it may be the power of our imagination that makes us such that so many things might be the object of the will. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
All right. The baton has been passed. Okay. Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. I've always wanted to come here, and this is my first visit, and it's beautiful here. And having lived in Ithaca for so many years, I don't even mind. Today was positively warm out, so it's very nice. And I have some videos, so I'm going to be hopefully not taking up too much time, but I may be switching back and forth here. Let's hopefully not get the technical stuff done. So I think there will be some connections you'll see. You'll also probably see some, I think now that hearing the whole talk all the way out, you're going to hear places where we might disagree too, which will be fun for the moderated discussion. But really, I'll start by saying that I don't really know if we have free will or not. I don't necessarily have to take a position on that as a psychologist, because my concern is what is it that we believe about our wills, and how does that belief develop from the time we're very young to all the way through the lifespan. So as a developmental psychologist and a cognitive psychologist, I'm more interested in what we believe about our free will than whether we actually have it. But I think that the beliefs are very informative. If you're interested in those more metaphysical questions, then maybe that'll come up in the discussion. So I will start with my own example. And hopefully the presenter tools are working for me here. In an interview in 2017 at the 50th anniversary of her running the Boston Marathon, Catherine Switzer, the first woman to run the Boston Marathon wearing an official bib, was asked to talk about the experience on a podcast that I listen to. As a runner, I religiously listen to runners' podcasts. She talked about the moment when the race director, the moment pictured here, where the race director, seeing that she was female, forcibly tried to remove her from the course. In her reflection, Switzer began by describing the personal significance of the event, her own simple desire to run. So from her own words, she said, "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just so proud of the fact that I knew I could do it." She had trained with a group of men and she had signed up as K Switzer for the race, and nobody knew that she was female. And of course, she knew she had the training. So anyone who runs in here will know, trust your training. You show up on the start line knowing you can do it. But when she described the decision to finish the race after being violently pulled off the course by the race director, this is a 19-year-old girl being pulled by a grown man down to the ground. And this was captured on film at the time. Not everybody had a cell phone camera. This was a moment that was captured by a press photographer that was there and then published afterwards. Her narrative of her own personal accomplishments started to change a little bit. And she started to talk a little bit more about the social significance of her action. And this is the quote. She says, "I was determined to finish. I wanted to prove that I could do it and that women everywhere could do it and that they should be allowed to do it. I realized women just needed opportunities, that they didn't believe in themselves, that they believed in the myths that surround arduous sports for women, and they were going to be forever limited by their capability." And then here she stops and corrects herself, or their belief in their lack of capability, rather, if they didn't have the opportunity to try otherwise. So Switzer's words to me perfectly capture what many psychologists take to be the essential components of our folk beliefs, our folk intuitions about what free will is. That is, that they involve our intentions. So she says things like, "I was determined to finish," and combine that with beliefs about possibility. The latter include beliefs about our ability to act, the many constraints on actions, and most critically, the ability to think about alternative possibilities for action. But her words also capture something else, and this is something that maybe in history seems more obvious in the questions that Adam was asking, but are not obvious in current psychological accounts of free will. She talks about her role as a member of a social group and what her actions reveal about the capabilities and, by extension, the possibilities for choice for other women. Her belief in her own abilities went against the social norms of the time, that women could not participate in arduous endurance sports. And her choice to act in violation of these social norms had an effect of changing the sport forever. So, what am I doing here? Can I get to the next slide? No. There we go. This is my nephew when he was little. I use pictures of my family because, you can't get permission to show other people's kids on slides. Here he is making a choice to play with a truck. Actually, this is funny because he still to this day really loves vehicles more than anything else. So he has this cube versus the truck, and he, of course, goes right for the truck. So I study the origins of these intuitions, like the one that Catherine Switzer had about what she felt to be a choice for her in early childhood. And it turns out that the origins of our beliefs in free will about things like intention, possibility, and constraints on possibility, and even the origins of our understanding that our actions may either go for or against social norms, emerge very early in life. And this suggests that they're a deep part of who we are. I'm trying to advance the slide. Okay, so the ability to think about human actions in terms of intentions, possibilities, and constraints actually emerges before children can even express this understanding through language. And this is an example of an experiment, not one of my own, by Garrigay, Beckering, and Corrali that was done in 2002 that illustrates this point very nicely. In this study, 14-month-old infants saw a woman pressing this panel that had a light on the top. So it's like a big button that if you press down on it, turns on the light with her head. It's a very strange thing to see. One group of infants saw her do this while her hands were placed freely on the table. So I was told that if I move the mouse over, you can see this. That's this group of infants over here saw her press the panel with her hands on the table. Another group of infants saw her press the panel and her hands were wrapped around her in a blanket. Well, sorry, wrapping a blanket around her. So they were physically constrained. Afterwards, each group of infants was given an opportunity to play with the panel themselves. And what infants do when they see in the lab a demonstrator perform an action is that they imitate. In this group of infants that saw her hands freely placed on the table imitated both the means of her action and the end goal. So they placed their hands on the table and they pressed the panel with their head. Whereas the infants who saw her hands wrapped in a blanket pressed the panel with their hands, the more efficient means. What this shows is that infants' reasoning about the intentions were based on their understanding that in one case, the actions were free to be otherwise, and therefore she must have meant to do it just like she did, and she must want me to do it that way as well, versus physically constrained. And had this woman who was holding the blanket been able to use her hands, she would have done so. That is the more efficient thing to do, after all. So that's already at 14 months, and I can show you actually examples of even younger infants who have expectations that align with this idea. Every time that an infant is reasoning about a human being, watching a human being, and infers that person has a goal, they're thinking about what that person could have done but didn't. In our lab, we look at this in 3- and 4-year-old children in verbal kinds of tasks. So older children do the same thing, and they can even talk about it. So we can have these little conversations with them where we tell them stories. We use a variety of methods. Here's one example. So for example, we show children different vignettes, stories about people doing things, and we ask them whether that person was free or not free to do what they wanted to do. So here's one free action. Sally likes orange juice. She drinks it every day, but one day she wants to drink milk. Can she just choose to drink milk, or does she have to drink orange juice because that's what she always does? And children say, of course, you can choose to drink milk one day. Just because you do it always one way doesn't mean you always have to. Versus this one, Sally jumps up in the air and comes down to the ground every day, but one day she wants to jump up in the air and float and never come down. Can she just do that? And children, of course, say, no, you cannot do that. You can't just float in the air. You cannot violate the laws of gravity just because you want to. So this is a very, very simple kind of reasoning for 4-year-old children. And in fact, in some of our tasks, we have children apply this to their own actions. And so I thought the videos would be cute to see. In this one, this is a drawing task that we use sometimes to look at how children experience their own free will. And we get them to draw pictures either freely or while being physically constrained. This kid was trying to draw a line on a piece of paper, and the experimenter held her hand in place so that she ended up with a dot instead of a line. And then we asked her to reflect on this experience.
Could you have drawn the line? Why not? Because it doesn't move because you got my hand really hard, so I can't still not move.
Perfect reason for why she could have drawn the line. Oh my goodness, what's up with that? Okay. Here's another one, since we were talking about mental constraints. So this is another drawing task where we put up a barrier, and the experimenter draws a picture and says, now it's your turn, you draw a picture, and the child draws a picture. So the child is drawing freely. They can draw whatever they want. The only thing they can't do is draw what's behind the barrier because they can't see it. And so then we lift the barrier and we say, well, before when you were drawing your picture, could you have just chosen to draw this picture over here that was blocked from view? And this kid says no, like all 4-year-olds, and he really tries to explain it. He locates the explanation in his mind, but he doesn't quite get it right.
All right, so now we're gonna work on the blue map. But first, can I ask you a question?
Sorry, it was a
about the
preschool
last
lab.
time on the orange map? So last time on the orange map, remember? When I put the paper up like this, would you have drawn this circle? No, why not? Because you were using your mind? Yeah. Can you tell me more about that?
I thought about this. My mind always thinks about silly things.
Your mind only thought about this because your mind only thinks about silly things?
Yeah.
My mind only thinks about silly things. So preschoolers not only understand which actions are free and which ones are maybe physically or mentally constrained, but they can apply their understanding to their judgments of other people's moral intent and who is morally responsible or not for their actions. So this is really important if you care about, if you care about free will, you care about the question of whether we are morally responsible for our actions. So if you know that someone is free, they're more morally responsible than if they're constrained. We put preschoolers in this situation. In this study, we introduced children to a machine that had these two levers, and we trained them that marbles could be placed on top of the machine and they would go down a chute inside. What you see here is there's a door that's open and a door that's closed, and we show them that if you press both levers together, the marbles come out the open door. But if you only press one lever, the marbles get lost. They get stuck behind the closed door and they get lost inside the box. And then we tell them about a friend, and we tell them that this is a story that works really well with 3-year-old children, that this friend needs her marbles back. And my puppet over here is going to play with the marbles, but these marbles have to go back, otherwise she's going to get very sad. So we can't lose them. And then they're introduced to a puppet, and this puppet has 2 big hands, and he does 3 things right in view of the child. First thing he does is he puts a marble in and he presses both levers, and the marbles go out the open door. So he does something that will help the friend retrieve her marbles. And then we tie the puppet's hands together, and the puppet presses one lever only, and the marbles get lost inside. And then in the third case, his hands are free, and the marbles get lost inside. We actually show these to children in various random orders so that it's not something about the order. We have all sorts of controls we use to make sure, but each child sees all 3 of these situations in a random order. And then we look at what the child's reaction is. And in fact, we measure their rates of moral protest. 3- and 4-year-old children will be very angry at you when you break rules or you do something wrong. And they will tell you, no, that's not how you do it. This isn't right. This isn't right. Hey, what are you doing? Or, hey, experimenter, can you please stop this guy? This isn't good. And we look to just measure that kind of reaction. And what we find is the only time that they protest his behavior is when he was free and he did the wrong thing. Obviously, they don't protest the good behavior, and they don't protest his behavior when he's physically constrained. And then we replicated this in another case with the same toy, only this time we told them that nothing bad was going to happen. There was just a simple rule. The rule was you had to press both levers, and a violation of the rule was one lever, and we get the same result. So whether it's a moral norm or just some simple rule, children protest actions that are free and wrong, not those that are constrained and wrong. So just to summarize, in the preschool years, children understand that there are constraints on our ability to act freely. This is actually, I think, very simple to the model of choice causes action, the one that Martha was showing. They have basically this model. And if we stopped here, you're going to say, well, kids look very similar to us. So really, there are no differences, right? This is exactly what our adult intuitions are about these cases, and children share those intuitions. But there is an important difference, which is that all possible causes of action, whether it be gravitational forces, the ability to see things and know them, the ability to act, to move your hands freely versus constrained, all of those possible causes of action will constrain freedom for a 4-year-old child. And that even means that other things that they know cause actions, such as desires or social norms, seem for a young child to be constraints on freedom. Let me show you what I mean. Here's another task where we ask 4-year-old children, am I seeing the 4-year-old here? Yes, I am. Okay. We ask them to tell us what their favorite food is and what their favorite fun activity is. We draw a picture of that thing, and then we say, imagine that thing is right here. Your favorite food is right here. And you really, really want it. It's your favorite. Can you just choose not to eat it? And this is what happens when you're 4.
All right, now tell me something you like to eat. What's a food you think is yummy?
Noodles.
Noodles. All right. Let's say it's a bunch of noodles on a plate. And you really like eating noodles. You think it's so yummy.
Yeah.
And your parents say it's okay for you to eat the noodles or not. Okay. So tell me, can you choose to not eat the noodles, or do you have to eat the noodles?
You have to eat the noodles.
Why do you have to eat the noodles?
Because it's yummy.
Because it's yummy. All right.
So this is actually a typical 4-year-old response. 4-year-olds think that if you want something really badly, you have to do it. A typical 6-year-old response is very different because 6-year-olds understand that they have self-control and are free to act against those immediate desires. And they give all various sorts of explanations for this.
All right. Now, tell me something you like to eat. What's something you think is really delicious?
Ice cream.
Ice cream. All right. So let's say it's a giant scoop of ice cream. Okay. And you really like to eat ice cream. You think it's yummy. Mom and dad says it's okay for you to eat ice cream or not. Okay. So tell me, do you have to eat the ice cream, or can you choose to not eat it, even if you like it?
Choose to not eat it.
Okay, why do you think you can choose to not eat it?
Because they're not really saying you have to, not really saying you can't. They're like giving you a choice.
Okay, you choose.
4-year-olds also respond as if the social norms and the moral norms that they know about constrain their actions in the same way. So this is another one of these drawing tasks. The drawing tasks produce the best videos. That's why I'm showing you them. Where a child was drawing a picture, and there was a puppet in the room, and we told him this puppet really hates circles. Triangles really make him cry and sad. And so the child drew something else, not a triangle. And then we asked him if he could have just drawn the triangle.
When Ellie was right here, could you have drawn the triangle? No, how come?
Because then it will make her sad.
Because then it would make her sad.
And the reason is as simple as that. 7-year-olds understand that we are moral agents and make free moral decisions. And so the 7-year-old will also do the right thing, not draw the thing that makes the puppet sad. But she knows that she could have chosen to do the wrong thing.
I'm gonna work on the green map. But first, let me ask the question of the last time on the pink map. So last time on the pink map, when Doggy was right here, could you have drawn the line?
Yes, but I didn't want to hurt Doggy's feelings.
Yes.
Yes, but I didn't want to hurt Doggy's feelings. That's mine, by the way. Many years ago. So just to summarize, here are the developmental changes that we see in early childhood. Younger children think that desires and emotions are constraints on action, almost like physical constraints. Older children, though, know that desires and emotions do not necessarily limit alternative possibilities. Younger children think that social norms and rules and morality are constraints on actions, and older children know that we make moral and social choices, that we're free to choose for ourselves to act in accordance with or against them. So one of the questions that I'm most curious about is, what is responsible for this change? How does this change? What kinds of experiences or developments or maturations happen that make children realize that they are actually free to do a lot of maybe challenging, difficult, or seemingly improbable or impossible things? So we can go back to this idea of physical control. A lot of people, when they're demonstrating free will, to, let's say, even if in a philosophy class, if you're trying to demonstrate what's the feeling that you have when you feel like you're using your will, you'll often do something like, okay, everybody decide whenever you really want to, we're gonna all sit here, and when you're ready, raise your hand. And then I've seen philosophers do this in class, and then, various people will raise their hands at various different times. And then you can say that feeling that you made a choice, that you controlled your action and that you did it, that's what free will is. That's what the intuition of free will is in our psychology. So the simple answer then for why children understand as they get older that they have better self-control, that they can act against their own desires or violate social norms, is that there are physical and maturational changes that enable children to be better at self-control. And so we have looked at this in our lab, and we indeed have found correlations between children's beliefs about their ability to act freely, to exercise self-control, and their actual ability for self-control. But there is a problem with this simple answer. The problem is if you look across cultures, you see an enormous amount of cultural variation in what children report to be possible to do. So here is one where we looked in the US, in Singapore, and China at these free will beliefs about acting against desires, about self-control, kind of like the one I showed you in that video with the noodles and the ice cream. And one thing that you see, I'm going to point to the screen, I guess. One thing that you see is that all of the lines go up. So younger children tend to say, this is what I was saying before, young children tend to say they're not free to act against desires, and older children tend to say they are. But another thing you see is that the lines are different. And in fact, the children in Singapore were the most pessimistic in this particular sample. I don't want you to make too much out of the cultural differences from small samples of kids, but the cultural differences are simply revealing of this underlying fact that, by the way, all of these kids, if you measure their self-control abilities, they all mature at exactly the same rate. All of these kids are getting better at self-control at the same rate. There are no cultural differences in this sample in their actual ability to self-regulate. The cultural differences are in their beliefs. And so the beliefs have to come in part from somewhere other than their physical experience. And the same is true about their beliefs about social norm. Again, here's a study comparing children in the US to Chinese and Malay children in Singapore. What you see is that age-related change across all three cultures that I mentioned. Younger children are more likely to say they're constrained by social norms and moral norms. Older children are more likely to say they're free to act against them. But you see this huge culture effect. In fact, in this study, it's quite striking. Singapore is a much more authoritarian and rule-governed society. Children in that society both feel more constrained by social and moral norms, and also make more references in their explanations to the consequences of acting against them, such as being punished. Children in the US in this study never mentioned any of those consequences. So they're paying attention to something other than their own experiences with action. So this question might come up in discussion, so I figured I'd sort of give my own response to it. Are free will beliefs a product of our experience of agency or a product of our social and cultural environments? And if, as I'm suggesting, there's some combination of the two, children are both getting better at making choices and also thinking about things in sort of through a cultural lens, then by what mechanism could these two things combine? My answer right now is the imagination. And the reason that I started thinking in this way comes directly from the kids themselves. So when children endorse free will in any of our studies, their explanations are more often than not imagined alternatives to the stories that we're telling them. So for example, in stories about inhibiting desires, children will make up reasons why you can act against your desires. Maybe you won't eat the yummy ice cream because you're too full. Maybe you won't eat that yummy cookie because it falls on the floor and get dirty. Or maybe mom says you have to eat dinner before you eat dessert. None of those things were mentioned in the stories that we told them. The stories we said were just, here's this yummy thing, can you choose not to eat it? And yet they make these stories up themselves. They get even really funny about it. So here's one where we asked a child if they could choose to hit someone. And the explanation from the 7-year-olds was he might not want his friend to be his friend anymore. So he might want to have another friend. That might be a reason to hit someone. That's a smart kid. I want to find out what they're like now. Or choosing not to share. She cannot share, but she has to be sneaky about it. Because maybe if she says, we don't get any candy today, she can just take it all for herself. So using lying as a mechanism for not sharing. So of course, these are really good kids, and I don't mean to suggest that they are not. I'm just saying that over this age range, in addition to an ability for self-regulation and better decision-making, children are developing a kind of imaginative flexibility that allows them to think of ways in which actions could be free that they didn't think before. And isn't that exactly what we see here? That's all I have. Thank you. Now,
Well, thank you both for those just tremendously stimulating talks with all kinds of great examples. I can share a couple thoughts that I had myself as I was listening. To Tamar, watching some of these videos, I can say that sometimes my mind also thinks about silly things that when I'm thinking about objects I can't necessarily see, so I could relate to the 4-year-old in that case. And Martha, when I experience pain, although I've never experienced the pain of Iraq, I definitely can't will myself to think about something else in that moment. And I was really struck by the ways in which, both from the philosophical perspective and from the psychological perspective, we're encouraged to think about our individual experience of free will in relation to the world. More than sometimes as historians, we think, of course, about individual experiences, but we're also thinking about the ways in which so many social forces might be constraining our freedom. So I thought we might start with a sort of very broad question about free will and our belief in free will. And the question, either one of you can tackle it. I don't know if Martha wants to tackle it first or Tamar, is, does it matter whether we really have free will if it seems to us, or if we are able to believe that we have free will?
Well, let me try to take a stab at that. So let's think of this analogy. Does it really matter to us whether our partner is faithful to us or just seems faithful to us? And I think we would say, yes, it does matter. And part of that is we care about truth. But part of it is that it affects, I think, the way we behave and what we would do. So, you know, had you known this, you would have acted differently in situations in the past. Or if you knew it, you might want to make different changes in your life. Or this is a word of Peter Strawson's, your reactive attitudes would be different towards the person. Were the emotions you felt towards the person appropriate emotions, or weren't they? And of course, that's very relevant in the case of free will. If people really don't have free will, then they aren't really morally responsible for what they do. And it's not appropriate to blame them, to praise them, to feel gratitude towards them when they do something nice for you, to feel hurt by them when they do something mean to you. And so that's my answer. It matters.
And there may be a connection to
Yeah.
at what age children feel morally responsible for the choices they're making.
Yeah, that's a question that I'm thinking about now a lot. Let me give another yes. So actually can't do better than the
Well,
faithful, but imagine that they're faithful versus faithful example. But I think another so two questions. One is, when you're faced with someone with a very different life circumstance than you, understanding your freedom in relation to theirs is really, really important, especially when you're talking about moral issues. So some of the things that you both were talking about was how we are not all free to the same extent, and our circumstances are very important in determining how much choice we have in our lives, free in the sense of making choices. And to say that it only matters how much you believe you have it is that strikes me as overly privileged. It actually really matters if you have it or not, because for some people, it definitely matters. It's life or death matters. Right now, the political situation that we're in the middle of is a good example, or in the Ukraine. And when you watch other people's freedoms being taken away from them, you feel it, feel it. And you feel it whether or not you believe you have free will. So I didn't talk at all about the differences when children are asked about themselves versus when they're asked about other people. So there's some really interesting things that happen when you turn the question in on the child themselves versus when you ask them about a third person. So this might be that second piece is, so for the desire tasks where children are asked, is a person free to act against desires? They're more likely to say another person is than that they are. So that's one thing we see in our data. There's a little bit of a difference. They're also more likely to say that you're free to do unpleasant things then that you're free to not do pleasant things, which is another difference. In fact, adults have that same, it's called an action bias, and you see it in social psychology as well. We tend to think of things we can do rather than things we can refrain from doing. So those are some cases. And then when they're thinking about other people, they're slightly more likely to say, well, this person over here is free to not eat the yummy cookie, but I'm not. Okay, what was the second question? You asked a question about at what case children feel their moral agency. So I think it's going to relate to that age. Children feel their causal agency from the time they're babies. So the power to reach for an object and bring it in, which children get when their motor skills are good enough to be able to reach for an object. So right around 3 months of age is usually when that starts. Some kids get it a little sooner than others. The power to crawl over to the other side of the room and grab the toy out of your sister's hand. Are you big enough to beat your sister up? That sort of thing. So there are many things that give children evidence of their own causal agency. The tricky thing with studying moral agency, which I really want to know more about it, is that it's hard to get any of us to admit we've done something wrong because of the enormous shame that we have when we do. So to get kids in the lab to say, I hurt someone would be a very difficult thing to do. So what we have to probably do is look at the emotions. We have to look at the shame response or the guilt response. And when you look at shame and guilt, you see them in 2.5-year-olds. So the self-conscious, the moral emotions begin to emerge in the toddler years, and then they get refined in preschool age. So hopefully that gives you a little answer.
Absolutely. It also leads me to want to follow up on some aspects of what both of you said, having to do with the relationship between freedom of the will, or even one's sense of one's freedom, and social circumstances, and the ways in which we might ask whether, owing to social circumstances, some people enjoy more freedom of the will than others. Could we say that given a set of circumstances in society, some people do enjoy more freedom of the will than others? We're encouraged, of course, to be aware of social inequities, of cultural privilege, and so on. And I'm wondering about how you think about evaluating the degree of freedom of the will any one individual may have and their own sense of their freedom of the will in the society in which they live.
I have to take that question first. Do you thinking about how to measure this, like in
Well, mostly I'm
experimental?
wondering when someone has an awareness of their situation in a broader society, whether we can say everybody has some freedom of the will, but some have more than others, and that affects the way in which they make choices and live their lives.
I would hope that that's true. It's
I
hard
mean,
to.
I'll say something about this.
Yeah.
Philosophers tend to conceive of freedom of the will as being blocked by, addiction, compulsion, and so on. But a lot of times we maybe can't choose to do certain things because it would just be too rude to do it, or we haven't got the guts to do it. And, or people don't act like that. So there are all kinds, I think, of social conventions, just manners that stop us from being able to choose to do certain things. And those can be greater or less, depending on the culture that you come from.
I think a lot of the limits we place on ourselves, those of us who don't have a lot of external constraints on our lives. So I'm just going to say people in circumstances that afford them a lot of opportunities for choosing, place a lot of limits on themselves in their imagination. And I certainly see it in adolescence when the limit is, I can't possibly wear that to school. I see that a lot at home sometimes. And what does that mean when in fact, I get this criticism a lot about my work when kids say, I can't be mean to someone. aren't they just confusing possibility with permissibility? And don't they, there's got to be a way to ask the question that unconfuses them. So I'll say there's two things that I've said about that. One is, I don't think they're confused. I think that the imagination of what is possible to do includes the permissible and the impermissible. And so it's not so much a confused, it's more that there are these overlapping concepts about possibility and permissibility, and that they're all in that space of what one can act to do. That because they're all causes of action. We are caused by our social forces, we are caused by internal forces, and we are caused by physical forces as well. Children have causal models, causal theories of action, just like we do. And in their causal theories are those social, the biological, the psychological, the physical, and they draw on all of that to try to make sense of any given action. And what counts as the real constraint is also very context dependent. You could say, like, she didn't go to the store to get ice cream because she was too full. She didn't have enough money. Her mom wouldn't let her. I mean, it could be any of a number of things. That's going to very much, and being able to kind of flexibly think back and forth among those is part of what 5, 6, 7-year-old children can do.
I found myself thinking with the graph that showed American children feeling by the age of 7 that they had more degrees of freedom, more or less. When it comes
Yes,
to the
they do.
adolescents, thinking I couldn't possibly wear that to school,
It
the
goes
way
right
in
back
which the graph could vary over the course of age, or a set of life experiences that make one feel more or less free to pursue one's dreams. An experience that suggests that one's hopes might be blocked, that there was a sense of opportunity foreclosed, and the ways in which that might, for a time, but not necessarily permanently, affect one's sense that the degrees of freedom were greater or less.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too.
We've been doing, I have it's hard to know how much in this context you're allowed to talk about unpublished data, but I have some collaborations with people who study purpose in life. Do we have purpose? And are we people who are purpose driven? And we've done so we've looked at some correlations between sort of standard scales of free will beliefs that are used in social psychology and standard scales of purpose and purpose-driven life. And we do find that these things are correlated in other people's work as well. Purpose, meaning free will, goals, they tend to go together. So if you have this idea, so maybe Catherine Switzer is a good example of that. She had a purpose for being out there, which made things possible that maybe she hadn't imagined would have been possible, or no one else would have imagined be possible. So sometimes maybe, yes, maybe the circumstances really matter more than the age. Yeah.
I imagine we have questions from the audience and maybe also online. So I want to make sure we can open things up for Q&A. There's a microphone right
Start with
here.
one online while you're coming up to the mic. So we have an anonymous attendee who posed this question during Professor Graham's talk, but either of you are welcome to address it. Isn't there a level of free will associated with the capacity to command ourselves to be rational, notwithstanding irrational impulses that may be within us? Is the exercise of so-called willpower an exercise of free will?
Was this for me or?
It looks like it was for you.
It came up during your talk, Professor Gibson, but
Well, I think it depends on whether you're exercising the willpower in a way that, in order to carry out some choice that you made, and if the choice was free in the making of it. So, I mean, for instance, I mean, you can just think of dogs who can have terrific willpower and yet we don't think that in doing what they're doing, say defending their territory, that they're doing it of their own free will. I think, some of my examples of extreme bravery are resisting coercion, take a kind of willpower. I mean, you have to steel yourself against what is at risk to your life. So I think sometimes willpower can help you achieve what you chose to do and help you display your freedom of will, but I don't think it necessarily does.
Hello. So I have a question for both of you, actually. Now, G.E. Moore put out an account of compatibilism and how one has the capacity to do otherwise in the face of a deterministic universe. But it is my understanding that Einstein's theory of relativity puts into question determinism at a microscopic level. My question for the both of you is, what implications do you think this has on the legitimacy of determinism on a macroscopic level? And I am just generally curious, Professor Kushner, you had mentioned earlier that you are unsure of whether or not we as human beings have free will, and I'd like to know a little bit more about where those doubts come from.
Oh, wow. So you're the philosopher, I'm not. So we'll, I'll defer to you on your question, actually. Or maybe I'll let Martha answer it
Thanks for
first.
that.
You just want to know my folk intuitions. I'm happy to talk about those, but I'll let Martha talk about philosophy.
Yeah, well, so, right, this is a kind of, some people say, don't worry if we live about the determinism, because we don't live in a deterministic universe. That is, our best scientific theory tells us that causation is not deterministic. But as you say, there's this question, even if it's indeterministic at the micro level, that doesn't mean that somehow bubbles up to the macro level when our actions are concerned. That means that it isn't deterministic at that level. So your question, just tell me again about this, is should we be worried about this or what? I have no idea the relationship between the micro level and the macro level. That's for a scientist. That is whether the indeterminism at the micro level would, as it were, bubble up to the macro level. But is that your question, or are you asking, should we be worried either way if determinism is true or if indeterminism is true?
I suppose my curiosity lies around choice and the natural law of cause and effect. And
well, so let me just try to say something about that. I mean, I think that there are many compatibilist theories that think that we're free if our choices are determined in a particular way by the right sorts of things. So just take these reason responsive accounts. You don't, let me put it a different way. Suppose that our choices aren't determined. That means either that they don't have causes or that the causes don't necessitate the effect. We don't seem to be in a better position. We seem to be in a worse position if either of those two things is false. So I recently gave my class an exercise. Imagine determinism is false and show why that wouldn't make us more free. And so someone said, well, suppose I went over to my grandmother's house, who I love, and she opened the door and I slapped her in the face. And I'm completely appalled at what I did. There was no cause of my doing this. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't decide to hurt her. This isn't something in my control. This is completely out of my control. Or suppose my decision was determined, but just probabilistically. So I wanted to give her a hug. There's a 50% chance I'll give her a hug and a 50% chance I'll slap her. I slapped her. Now, that didn't make anybody any more free. So I think a standard compatibilist line is you want your decisions to be caused, and you want them to be caused deterministically by what? Well, what's rational relative to your beliefs and desires. That's what the rationality account would say. I mean, other people may have other views about what that is, but it's as though everybody's worried about determinism. Nobody's worried about indeterminism. Indeterminism would make us much worse off. And to have control over our actions and our decisions, we want them to be caused in certain ways by certain psychological states of ours, not addiction, not compulsion, and so on. So that anyway is the standard compatible line on that.
We have several more questions online. An anonymous attendee asks, is maximizing capacity to choose according to belief or desire, i.e. free will, and capacity to act according to will, i.e. agency, a fair life goal?
Fair life goal. I think freedom is a good life goal. I'm not sure I would define it the way that the questioner did. I think I can maybe, there's a little, I can't say anything about determinism, because mostly I think it would be a trap for me too, since I'm not a physicist, I'm not a metaphysicist, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a developmental psychologist. I think about human beings, and I think maybe closer to where Adam is coming from, I think about our social circumstances a lot. And whether we cause our circumstances or whether our circumstances cause us. That question that you started with, such a beautiful question. It's a fair life goal to work to seek the freedom to have the circumstances that suit you. It's also a fair life goal to recognize the cases in which you are not free and accept them. So I am too old to be fighting against those circumstances anymore. I think I love my life when it involves the compromises I have to make for the people who I love, the relationships that I care about, the society and the community that I live in. In what sense is that me exercising my free will? I mean, maybe in this sort of more bird's eye view sense, it's a purposeful or a meaning-driven life that I've chosen to be in my community and to do what I can to make the world a better place, either through my science or through raising my children or teaching my classes or whatever little bit in my own little garden that I can grow and nurture. It almost means that the question isn't as much about whether I need to work towards having free will, but just to recognize what I do have and what I can do with it. And in a way, it's a similar kind of enterprise. That's my personal, I don't know if that's helpful. And that's how I avoid the philosophical problems. I am very curious about what I can do and accepting of the things that I can't. Yeah.
I have 4 points and no questions, so take that as you will. First, the philosopher makes a rather normative statement that indeterminism makes us worse off. Not sure where to go with that.
Well, with regard to freedom is the claim. Not.
Wow.
Anyway. I did make that claim, yes.
So it was explained to me a while ago that you don't choose your beliefs, that you don't choose to believe in gravity, for example. If it's explained to you and you have such a amenable worldview, it kind of just goes right in, a la Quine. There wasn't really much talk about the brain-body structure function. And lastly, Simone de Beauvoir gives us a theory of facticity, what is, and transcendence, what could be. So as Voltaire said, mind your garden. Thanks.
I'll go to another online question. We have a time for a couple more in the room if desired. From Jim, you say that if there's no free will, we aren't justified in punishing or praising others for bad or good behavior. But if there's no free will, then wouldn't that mean we are not free to punish or praise? We do what we do because we can't help it.
Yeah, that's a whole area.
Well,
I don't know if you
I think it's a question of what we ought to do, not what we do. And so if we don't have free will, then it seems like what we ought to do is, or how we ought to view people is quite different than the way that we do when thinking that they're to blame or to be praised or responsible and so on. That would be my point.
It's a whole other lecture on whether on the legal implications, but I do know some philosophers that talk about other ways into this idea of what's punishable or how we should think about punishment and crime and things like that when we have, if we believe in determinism. So maybe there's what you need to do is invite like Dirk Parabum to come and give a talk and have him discuss it. But I can listen to those arguments and be somewhat convinced that there could be other ways to set up legal systems when you understand that people are often not responsible. I mean, it may make us more compassionate, but it probably wouldn't change a lot of what we do as well. So maybe that's a topic that can be another hour conversation. Can I say something a little bit about the brain? Because I don't look at the brain, but I'm aware of the fact that we sort of avoided the neuroscience here in the Libet studies and all of these things that people like, or Libet, things that people like to talk about when they talk about whether we have free will and the readiness potential. And I'm assuming that you're referring to some of that. Are you referring to the Libet studies and the idea that our actions are caused before we're aware that they're caused?
Well, there's just like one example that sticks out. A little graphic, but there was a person in Texas some years ago who had a brain tumor and just started killing people.
Yeah, so there's really interesting work on those kinds of cases, on various neurological disorders or brain injuries that can cause all sorts of errant behaviors, some of which is dangerous. And this is another, I think it falls under the cases that are where there are some people who just aren't as free as others, and we have to be aware of that. I think that's a theme that we've been talking about. I don't know that particular case, but I'm interested in it. I was thinking that you were talking about where the choices are in the brain, which is another thing that people study when they study free will. They're looking for the brain basis of voluntary action. Where are voluntary actions actually in the brain? Where does the motor system connect with our executive system such that we engage in voluntary actions? And in fact, a lot of these things are done in animal models because other species there's lots of species that engage in voluntary, executively controlled actions. We are by far, we're not the only ones by far. It's most animals, in fact. All animals have some sort of control mechanism for action. Any animal that has a nervous system and moves. And so that's the direction if you want to look into that work. I'm not going to be able to speak to it. It's not my area, but I'm happy to give you a path to follow if you're interested in references to that.
Maybe I'll close this out on one last question that's relevant for many of us. I'm going to paraphrase. If we're online and we are force-fed ads for something that we have demonstrated interest in through an algorithm, do we have free will to not buy, or is that determinism?
I think move the target a little bit. So we can be coerced. That doesn't mean we don't have the potential to be free. But the awareness, the media savvy kids that I know, including my own, who will tell me exactly what's feeding them the ads. That awareness, understanding that they're being fed all of that stuff goes a long way towards helping themselves. And yet even then, it's really, really hard. I mean, I think the only thing you can do if you really, really want to have circumstances in which you can make uncoerced choices is to set up an environment that's free of that coercion. And that's become increasingly hard over our lifetimes, yeah.
So I wanted to say something to a question way back about the person who said, should it be a life goal to have free will? I think you should distinguish having a free will from exercising your free will. And we forget that the exercise of free will has had, in some people's hands or minds, has had disastrous consequences in the 20th century. There's Stalin, Hitler, and Pol Pot. They exercised a lot of free will. So I wouldn't say that it should be a life goal of anybody to exercise. I mean, just exercising free will per se is a life goal. We all, of course, want to have as much freedom of will as we can and not be subject to constraints on what we can choose to do. But that's different from exercising as much free will as you can.
I think we've more or less run out of time, but I can also see how this session is naturally setting the stage for the next session on what is morality. The connections between today's discussion and what I think will come next seem already teed up. So thank you very much for being here, and please join me in thanking Professor Gibson and Professor Kushner.